Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. This is Orphan Last, aka Skylar Madison, and today I'm going to be doing a bit of an animation experiment in this video. Now, as you can see, it's unfinished, and although it has some personality to it, I feel as though this is a failed attempt using an impractical animation technique that eventually winds up building more and more project creep to the point to where you wind up with an unbelievable number of layers that just gets more and more complicated as you move along. There's not very many people trying to animate on YouTube using Blender. It's kind of unexplored territory in a lot of ways. And so this is my first real experiment trying to make a real animation in Blender. And I think I'm allowed to have a few failures. As such, this is not an animation tutorial, but here you can view it at 10% speed. Throughout this video I'll be describing the workflow, discussing the good, the bad, the ugly. Okay, so just starting out, I was having trouble visualizing the animation, and even the poses. It's been a while since I last animated anything, and so I'm a little bit out of practice. Now, of course, I could have gone on to Blender Swap and downloaded a rig that could be posed and such like that, and I could have done that for free, but I'm more familiar with the 3D models that are integrated into Clip Studio Paint. For me, as of right now, they're easier to pose, and so that's just what I wound up using. So I posed a rig up and exported images into Blender so that I could use them as references for keyframes. Now, it may look like tracing, and sure, for some parts, yeah, it's tracing, but that's one of the ways that you can use these rigs. It's not necessarily what they're made for, but I personally posed them for my personal use, and I really didn't see a problem with that because animation is a ton of work, and if I can find a shortcut here and there, then great. I think I'm entitled to being able to use that. Even with what I did animate, it took me about 10 hours to accomplish, and it's a failed attempt, so tracing or not, it doesn't really matter. It's a failed attempt. Fortunately, not all of the work I did needs to go to waste, though. As I move along with drawing out my keyframes, you'll notice that I'm not being entirely loyal to the rigs, in that the proportions of my mascot look significantly different than the rigs. So, you know, I'm not just tracing. There is a thought process being used here. Ultimately, I just planted these Clip Studio Paint rig images into Blender as reference images and planted them into the animation one at a time. These images were just JPEGs, actually, so nothing special. I just exported them as JPEGs from Clip Studio Paint and then put them into Blender. Nothing too complicated. I made 2 errors early on with this step, actually, and it's probably a good thing that this is a failed attempt because of at least one of them. I'm trying different animation techniques so that I can figure out a way to animate a new intro for my channel. And ever since I've gotten this new theme song, it's frustrating having an old animation standing in while I play my theme song music. The animation is too short and doesn't have enough visually interesting things happening for as long as the theme song is. And so I'm just kind of doing something that's a happy little compromise for right now. So basically, this is my roundabout way of saying that my first mistake was not importing the music into the animation and making sure that things time up perfectly with the beat and the melody of the music. That was my biggest mistake here. So again, it's a good thing that this is a failed attempt, I guess. Once I feel that I've made a good video intro for my channel with a solid workflow, I'll be teaching how to animate something more helpful in Blender. Something more helpful than just a bouncing ball and a moving bouncing ball. And I'll be doing this sort of tutorials as I animate the outro for my channel. Or at least, that's the plan for right now. I mean, who knows, I might give up on Blender as a 2D animation software and do it in Clip Studio Paint, or I might just fork out the money necessary to get Kikani. But I do promise that I will do my best to learn how to do 2D animation inside of Blender. But if I wind up wasting 100 hours or 150 hours worth of work and my channel winds up having a collection of failed animation attempts, then I think I'll be moving over to a different piece of software for my 2D animation stuff. My second mistake while drawing out my keyframes was that I designed it all around the idea of having an artificial camera movement. So instead of me moving the camera to zoom out and away from my mascot, I just shrunk my mascot. This posed a number of problems later on. Basically, I had to really worry about line weight. And if your line weight starts getting really ratty, then you can run into some major issues because there's no tool inside of the sculpt mode that allows you to smooth your line weights. Also, when your animation starts getting smaller and smaller and smaller, the control fidelity of your line work winds up decreasing as well. And it also makes your drawings look crappier and crappier and crappier. These two issues wind up compounding one another. They're kind of one and the same in a way. Generally, my impressions of Blender as a 2D animation software is kind of mixed. I don't feel as though the control fidelity is there when it comes to animating frame by frame. Maybe some people out there might have mastered it, but things just wind up looking wrong. And this is especially so when you're trying to animate something rather small. Of course, I've mentioned that earlier. But regardless, big or small, it definitely doesn't feel like drawing with pencil and paper. It feels like you're pulling dead weight when you draw, and you can't even see your pressure sensitivity interacting with your line work until after your line is drawn. So basically, after you draw something out, you're flipping over to your sculpt mode and having to sculpt it and play around with your line width and then revert back. And you don't have to do that in any other piece of software. Again, this isn't to say that you can't do frame-by-frame animation in Blender. I'm just mentioning the downside to trying it. Basically, if things aren't turning out right, you have the sculpt tool that can sometimes help you, and you can press Ctrl-Z a billion times until things match up to look right, but generally, it doesn't feel like an ideal software for frame-by-frame animation. That's really ultimately what I'm saying here. If you can do it, then by all means, go ahead and do it. I would just hate to animate frame by frame in Blender. Also, I find the eraser tool inside of Blender to be completely worthless for the grease pencil. I find myself jumping into edit mode and selecting strokes and vertices and deleting them, which made a lengthy process, but made a much better result than that stupid eraser tool. So I had a few false starts when animating, but eventually I got to the point to where I felt like it was time to animate the torso. So I basically just created a silhouette of the shirt and sculpted it into shape for each keyframe and sculpted it into the shapes that each keyframe needs. And once that was accomplished, I used the exact same workflow that I used in order to make the moving bouncing ball. It's basically a shape tweening workflow. And again, there's a ton of pitfalls to this workflow, and I really don't recommend it. The next thing that I decided to tackle was the palm of the hand, which isn't really that visible. And I also went about drawing out the index finger, the silhouette of the palm of the hand and the index finger. And I made sure that the index finger specifically, and all the other fingers as well, did the shape tweening action that looked like it could pass as a convincing hand closing and balling up as a fist. And of course I repeated this process for each and every single finger, just shape tweening the fingers to kind of a closed position. Please keep in mind that each shape is on its own layer, and eventually the layers panel gets really convoluted. And when things get convoluted like that, I start to hate life. Also, keep in mind that I needed to remember to lock all the layers except for the layer that I was currently working on. This made sure that the only layer that was getting manipulated was the unlocked layer. This is a big drawback to this workflow because I oftentimes found myself accidentally working on the wrong layer and having to start all over again with a task on the correct layer. Also, you can't have more than one shape on a layer. So this means that although you may want to animate both eyebrows in one fell swoop, nope, you have to have a layer for the left eyebrow and then another layer for the right eyebrow. It's a real pain in the butt. Again, this is the downfall of this particular workflow, and it somewhat became the bane of my existence. It's just way too many layers. You spend your time looking at the layers panel way more often than you do actually working, it feels like sometimes. I created a layer called line work, and my thoughts were that I'd use this layer to put details into the silhouettes of objects, because that's ultimately what I'm shape tweening, the silhouettes of objects. So line work is to just kind of add those interior details and stuff like that. And that worked out well, but you don't always know what you're going to be animating frame by frame, and that's ultimately what I was using this line work layer for, kind of animating things frame by frame. There were some situations where I'd give up kind of midway through with the line work layer and then just create new layers for whatever it was that I was trying to animate on the line work layer and then shape tween them. So this means that sometimes there's different objects throughout different portions of the animation that are on different layers, which makes the whole animation way more complicated than it should be. The alternative is to just redo it all over again on the new layers that you created once you decided, hey, yeah, at this point it's getting a little bit too convoluted to do it frame by frame with the line work layer. Once the fist was all balled up in a fist, I decided that I should use the palm layer and draw out the full silhouette of the entire fist. That way the layers for the index finger, the middle finger, the ring finger, and the pinky, they all wouldn't have to have individual shape tweening throughout the entire animation. I could just animate that one palm layer throughout the entire animation from that point forward, because it wasn't something that would be of any emphasis anymore. I initially draw the entire fist on the palm layer with a stroke because I needed to see my line work, and so I used the line work layer to draw out that line work, and then I applied the skin material to the palm layer after the fact, after that. It looked different than the fist with all the layers composing the hand, but it also kind of gave it a look like the fist tightened up, like the fist clenched a little bit more, and so I kind of liked that. But again, I don't think this shape tweening technique for a whole animation was meant to be. I don't think this is a practical workflow. I even added a thumb layer in there too, because the thumb was just barely visible inside of my keyframes. Then I added a little bit of the suit in there, because he's wearing a suit and tie, and I even tried to make the tail of the suit to look like it was waving, because the mascot is in mid-air, but that never looked right. And after the fact, I remembered that there's actually a wave distortion effect that you can add in the visual effects properties. So my attempts at trying to have cloth kind of waving behind him was really unnecessary. I could have just drawn out one thing and just had that distortion effect be applied to that layer throughout the entire animation, and it would have looked just fine. Instead of continuing to work on an animation that I've already decided is a failure, I've opted to spend the rest of the week writing this script that you're currently listening to and recording the audio, and most importantly, to spend the rest of the week entrenched in better ways to animate inside of Blender, basically. Time for me to study for the rest of the week. But I just hadn't seen someone try an approach like this, where everything is just shape tween, and I really wanted to see if I could effectively give it a try. But I'm sure that if I just hadn't made him shrink, I would have probably continued animating this thing. Even though there are elements to this animation that I look at that I kind of consider close to finished that just still don't look right. But so it's generally a good thing that this is a failed attempt. But if I had continued, I'd be creating more and more and more and more layers, and as you wind up having more and more layers, the slower and slower the workflow winds up becoming. Because basically what winds up happening is you're constantly trying to hunt down the right layer to animate with it, and then lock it or unlock it or whatever it is. Sometimes you get paranoid and you're like, what layer was I on? Is it locked? And you're hunting down, trying to find it just to find out that it was locked after all. It's a real pain in the butt. And sometimes the sculpting process would be quick, and other times it took freaking forever. But sometimes once you'd move on over to animating several things to look just right in the animation, suddenly you'd realize that you'd have to go back to the last 3 things that you've just finished animating and resculpt them a little bit, frame by frame, just so that this new part of the composition that you just shape tweened can look right with everything else. So there's a lot of repetition. You're having to go back constantly and fix things. Keep in mind that even with the things that are polished with this animation, there are still things that I'm fully aware are not finished. I never made a layer for the neck, the hips, the belt, the neck, and etc. There's probably more things that I'm not considering offhand. I made a shape for the head, then sculpted that same shape to match the other keyframes. It's not like you can draw a shape on one frame and then redraw it on another frame. That really doesn't work. I tried it towards the tail end of the video. Although it will interpolate, the shape tweening seems to always do some weird morphing action. So you have to make sure that the same vertices that are in a specific place on one keyframe drawing are in the same place on the next keyframe drawing. Otherwise, you'll still wind up with bizarre results. I did a semi-convincing head turn in this animation, and although it's passable, I guess, I would give it a C- if I were to grade my own work with the quality of this animation and how it looks, and what degree of professionalism it is. It's about a C- in my opinion. Basically, I'm thinking that next time around, I'll get more of those Clip Studio Paint models and pose them doing a head turn, just multiple images of that model doing a head turn. That way I can hand sculpt the shape of the head frame by frame to match rather well with that somewhat. Like I said earlier, the proportions of my mascot are different than these models, than these rigs, basically. So I'd be sculpting them to match within reason. The mascot shouldn't lose its proportions just because I happen to have something as a reference. But more information about the head turn. Initially, the head turn looked weirder than it currently does, and that was because I forgot to get the mascot to blink as his head turned. But I'm used to only using something like 4 frames to get the eyes to blink, for the eyes to close and then open back up again. But since everything is shape tweened, I need to be working on ones rather than working on twos. So the eyes blinking don't even register in the animation. When you watch the animation, you don't even realize that his eyes are blinking. So this means that the blinking animation should have been something more like 8 frames instead of 4. This workflow can create some cool looking stuff, but it definitely has its limitations. And I think I'll be using this workflow for whatever moments that a cutout animation rig winds up failing at doing. I then decided to make a layer for the hair. Initially, I wanted the hair spikes to be on the same layer, but that kept posing problems. The first attempt with the hair spikes took forever, only for me to abandon the attempt, and later on, I wound up dedicating the hair spikes to their own layer and having to repeat everything that I did previously in order to try and get it to tween properly. I don't mind sculpting with 2D animation and such like that, but when it gets to being really intensive, it can get really irritating, and especially when it's intensive in a stupid sort of way. I mean, you don't have to do all of that with Kakani, so why would we have to do that inside of Blender? Anyhow, it just kind of made me wonder if I was even saving any time sculpting everything compared to just animating things frame by frame. But I'm afraid Blender isn't something that I'd want to animate frame by frame in. So I guess I was saving time. One of the things that I find frustrating is that the stacking order on your layers panel seems to dominate the 3D space. So what this means is if your character's head is below the shirt on the stacking order in the layers panel, just moving the head closer to the camera in the 3D space won't make it so that it's in front of the stacking order. For some reason, the shirt will still overlap over the face. So if I wanted to move the head on top of the stacking order, I'd have to move a ton of layers along with it. The hair spikes, the hair, the left eyebrow, the right eyebrow, the eyes, the mouth, and all of that, just all of that would have to move. But I think I might have accidentally had masking turned on one of my layers. I'm not quite sure which one. So even when I did try that, I wound up having some really weird results where different layers were clipped inside of other layers in rather bizarre ways. And so I just concluded that the head is just near the bottom of the stacking order on the layers panel. I just gave up on that attempt. I wouldn't have ever done that if I had known that this would pose a problem, that the 3D space didn't dominate the stacking order. But I guess I could create even more layers, I guess, with a 0 alpha in order to mask things inside of it, so that maybe that would be a way to circumvent the stacking order as it relates to the layers panel or something. But that would just compound the issue of this entire workflow. The main problem with this workflow is that for every new layer that you create, it just bogs down the entire workflow. Anyhow, it's when I started shape tweening the hair down to the smaller keyframe, and then also working with the eyebrows down to the smaller keyframe, that I really started to notice my main foundational flaw to this animation. And it is a foundational flaw. At its core, this animation is flawed, and I would say irreparable. When your vertices start to get super congested because you've shrunk something down for a shape tween, the sculpting process gets completely unmanageable, and the line widths become completely unworkable and ratty, and there's no way to fix that. Again, there's no way to smooth your line thickness inside of Blender. And what I mean by that is, when you press shift and you start kind of just rubbing on a line when you're in sculpt mode, it smooths the line out with its shape, but there is nothing to smooth out the line thickness the same sort of way. But even after that, even after I shrunk a few things down and shape tweened them to that smaller keyframe, I kept working on it a little while, but I wound up thinking, why even bother when I could just call it quits, output the video to let everyone know what it is that I'm studying right now, and then spend the rest of the week discovering a better technique so that I can teach you guys how to do it down the road, hopefully. So again, here's the final animation. I don't hate it. There are some redeeming bits to this animation. It was a fun experiment, and it was worth doing. There are times I think that I would use this technique with this workflow, especially if I can nail down cutout animations and such. But I don't think it's something I'd want to do all the time for an entirety of an animation. There's just too many issues with it. Anyways, guys, that pretty much concludes it for this video. If you guys enjoyed it, please feel free to like, share, and subscribe. If you'd like to participate more with my community, there's a link to my Discord in the video description below. And if you'd like to support this channel, there's an image of my mascot in the upper right corner of the screen. It leads to my Patreon. Any support would be much appreciated. If you've enjoyed this content and would like to see more, feel free to click on anything else that's appearing on the screen right now. Thank you very much for your time.